Cowboying. Well, I can't claim to be born to the saddle as some cowmen can. My folks were from Virginia, and I came west with relatives after my father had been killed in the war. There's a loss of memory here, for he was born in Elkhart, Indiana, and for the next sentence, HJS, from Ohio, we went to Kansas, where the land grants were generous during the early 70s. Texas Longhorns, range country, gringos, and saddle and spurs were imposing sounding terms to me, as they were the most every adventurous youth of that day. Branding cattle trails across hills and plains, river country, and arid stretches through buffalo grounds. Indian territory and frontier villages across the 2,000-odd miles from Texas to Montana was a boy's ambition, as making trails through the sky is today. My first trip to Texas was in 1877. I was then about 18 and was thrown on my own responsibility. In those days, they could always use men in Texas. I tried to hide my youth, and after a while I found a job with a cattle outfit. I took to life in the saddle like a duck takes to water, and it wasn't any time until I loved the spirited broncs and even the ugly Texas Longhorns. One of my first jobs was with the Adling brothers. They had a ranch on Cow Creek in the Indian Territory, and we drove the stock from there to Whitebone, Texas for shipment. In 1878, I was with Hunter Evans, and Hunter, who supplied beef for the Cheyenne and Comanche Indians at Fort Sill and Fort Reno under contract with the government. After I had been there a couple of years, one of the fellows who was going home to Kansas for a visit persuaded me to go with him. By that time, I had accumulated some money, and besides, I felt a full-fledged cowpuncher and was perhaps thinking of the impression I would make on the folks in Kansas. It was in the early summer of 1879 when we hit the trail north. We packed our bedroll and grub kit light and picked out the best horses we could get. There was no mistaking our profession. Stetsons, ropes, boots, and spurs branded us unmistakably as cowboys. We each had between $100 and $200 apiece in our pockets. With all the enthusiasm of youth, we must have felt pretty cocky at the start, and we probably showed it. But before we ended our trip, we weren't so proud. In fact, we were glad to get there alive without bragging that we were cowpunchers. You see, we didn't know what we were getting into in Kansas. You've heard of the Kansas Jayhawks? Well, this fanaticism had taken hold of some otherwise pretty level-headed old-timers. If there was anything unpopular with these Jays, it was a cowboy. We didn't know when we entered the state that we were about as popular as a rattlesnake. The first time we tried to get something to eat, we found out that they were sincere in their dislike. Our money couldn't buy us food. If some of them would have weakened at the sight of money, there were plenty around to see that they weren't violating any rules and regulations. Towns weren't so close together in those days, and by the time we had gone into the second day without finding any place that would sell us food, our stomachs were empty. And it wasn't so pleasant sitting on a horse. Maybe we could have struggled on, but we were used to giving our horses a square deal and weren't seeing them go hungry any longer. We were on the trail by 4 o'clock the third morning. Hunger kept us from sleeping. It was just starting to get light as we were passing one of those Kansas cornfields, and while one of us watched the road, the other stole into the cornfield and collected enough corn to feed the horses. About the time the horses were getting enough, a cloud of dust that was indicated by the approach of some kind of vehicle appeared down the road, and we were on our way. We traveled slow enough to let the coming wagon overtake us, and we were rather surprised to find a traveling peddler going from town to town as late as the 70s. We held a hope for a minute that this traveler might be educated to all the despicable qualities of a cowboy, but this hope was blasted in a hurry when he tried to buy food from him and were refused point blank. There was no use arguing. All that money and we couldn't buy a slice of bread. The trader was about middle age and had whiskers so long and dusty that when he sneezed it started a windstorm, and the dust that flew completely obscured the surrounding landscape. Otherwise, he wasn't so fierce-looking, we thought as he watched him trailed off. We lagged behind to finish feeding the horses and collect a few ears of corn for ourselves. Going along the trail a few minutes later, we thought we saw a smoke line coming up from the bank of a nearby stream. There was nothing to indicate that our trader friend was on the trail ahead of us, and we suspicioned that he had something to do with the faint train of smoke. We decided to do some investigating, but this was safer on foot, so we dismounted and made a careful approach to the bank of the stream. As we came near the little knoll over which the smoke was rising, both Bob and I sniffed the air and gave each other significant glances. Unless our senses were plumb distorted from hunger and fatigue, we were getting a whiff of frying bacon. We quickened our pace. From the top ridge of the knoll, we looked down to the sandy bank below, and there beside a clump of willows was a campfire. Long Whiskers was busy stirring up a mixture that promised to result into pancakes. Bob and I didn't say anything, but we thought plenty. We watched the fire burn up and the first cake sizzle in the bacon fat. Then an added torture. Out came the coffee pot, and the smell of Java mingled with the cakes and bacon. Bob looked at me. "What'll we do?" he whispered. I didn't hesitate. "We are going to eat." We waited a little longer till the stack of cakes looked more imposing. Then I pulled my gun, and with a couple of jumps we were in the camp, and I had our trader friend covered. He glanced towards the wagon. He wasn't packing a revolver, and there was no time to reach his gun. I thought it was up to me to do some explaining, so I said, "Sorry to interrupt your breakfast, partner, but we'd like to borrow those things for a while." While I kept him covered, Bob found the trader's gun, handed me the coffee pot, and picked up the pan of cakes and bacon. We promised to be back, then we backed out of the camp. A little ways down the stream, we found a place to enjoy our breakfast. Figuring he was pretty harmless for the present, I've never had a breakfast that tasted better, and not just because it was acquired at the point of a gun. Well, we returned his property to the top of the knoll because we weren't sure what kind of a reception he might have planned for us. We didn't even stop to thank him. Political strife had made Kansas an undesirable place to live, and I found that most of my family were in Illinois or Indiana, but I myself had no desire to live in the East. In 1880, I was back in Texas with the LX Bar outfit, and I was initiated into cattle trailing proper. We started from their ranch just above old adobe walls for Hunnewell, Kansas, over the Monument Hill Trail. I didn't imagine there would be anything agreeable about trying to feel at home at the end of the trail, terminating in Kansas, and as this was a short trip, I joined a South Texas outfit at Cimarron Ridge Crossing. They were going to deliver a herd to the Pine Ridge Agency at Nebland. The herd was delivered there to the government in November. There was nothing to remain in that part of the country for, so I left Nebland with a very pretentious-looking outfit, consisting of a wagon and a 4-mule team that I had bargained for at the agency. At that time, Deadwood, South Dakota was a mining center, and a number of men interested in it had big cattle interests as well. I stayed at Deadwood during the winter, and in the spring I established connections with the Niobra Cattle Company, which finally brought me to Montana.